Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV, and we are continuing our week of kind of a variety of topics. And this show came about reasonably suddenly because of various things, scheduling issues, and I contacted our guest today not that long ago. But I'm actually really happy to tackle it, and it seems very appropriate to tackle this subject today, the myth of the clean Wehrmacht in World War II, because there's been a number of situations on Twitter and social media the last couple of weeks. You may have seen them where people kind of questioning the study of the Holocaust alongside the study of the military. Can you separate the two? Do they go hand in hand, and so on and so forth? And so it seems rather appropriate to be talking about it. So my guest today is an independent scholar and writer, and this is the result of several years of work. David A. Harrisville. So good afternoon, David. How are you today?
Great. How about yourself? And thanks so
I'm
much.
Good. Yeah. And as I was saying at the top of the show there, I'm really quite excited about this show because we're going to sort of burst some balloons and shatter some myths. And the thing is, I want to get it clear at the beginning, this is all based on research. It's not just opinion, because I think when it comes to the Third Reich in World War II, a lot of people just have an opinion, whether it's about a particular general or a particular unit or an aircraft type or a tank type, and they don't necessarily have anything to draw on. They just think, well, this is this, because I've always thought that. So how and why did you begin tackling this subject? How long has it been taking you to do it, and what was the initial aim? And did the result end up being what you were hoping it was going to be?
Thank you. So I really became interested in the Second World War and the Wehrmacht as a little kid. I remember when I was probably 5 years old playing with little plastic soldiers with my dad, and over the years, it turned into, from a childhood obsession into a serious academic study. So I majored in history as an undergraduate. Actually wrote my thesis about the Sherman tank in the Second World War. And then I got into graduate school, and I started to become more interested in the German side. It was just a lot less familiar to me. D-Day and Saving Private Ryan and Operation Market Garden were familiar subjects, but I was always intrigued by, what are the bad guys thinking? What's motivating them? The good guys make a little more sense to me. And I kind of gravitated toward the Eastern Front because it's an area that I didn't know much about. And I think a lot of Americans in general, most people tend to know the more Western side of the war or the Italian campaign maybe, but the Eastern Front is kind of a blank spot. But it's where the vast majority of German soldiers fought. Of course, you had the Soviet Army, a massive campaign, the biggest front in the Second World War. And so what I wanted to do in my project was to kind of bring a new perspective on that conflict. Originally, I was going to, and so this came out of my dissertation research, I was going to write about religion in the German army. And then I got into the archives and was actually sort of bored by the documents I was reading, lots of reports by chaplains. I actually wrote my master's on chaplains in the German army, which I thought was interesting that they had any. I didn't think Hitler would allow that. But I got more interested in the moral dimensions of the war. So what are the Germans thinking about themselves? How are they justifying what they're doing? Taking a kind of moral analysis angle into the Wehrmacht, which no one has really quite done before. And it's spent years first in Israel. I started my research and then spent about a year and a half in Germany, went to about a dozen different archives, and spent the most time in Berlin. There's an archive that collects soldiers' letters, and they've got, I think it's over 100,000 letters that they've collected so far from across Germany. And so I spent a lot of time there, also a lot of time in Freiburg, at the military archive that some viewers might be familiar with. So that's kind of the origin of the project.
Well, brilliant stuff. And the other thing is, of course, is we're dealing with the fact it's come up on World War II TV. We did our Histography of the Germans in Normandy show a few months ago now. And this idea people have, there's no German archives. They don't exist. There isn't anything. and we're not talking particularly. Well, you did just mention the military archives, but this idea of the personal letters is really extraordinary because so we encounter people and say, you won't find anything, there's nothing there, and 100,000 letters. So it was a question I was going to ask you a bit later on, but going through that amount of letters, there is going to be a lot of kind of "Hello, Mum, can you send me some chocolate?" kind of stuff. But how did you source these letters, and what was the process of kind of pulling out and trying to get some idea of this, as we're going to be discussing later on, the ideology, what they're thinking about, and also the censorship issue, because every military letters home are censored. So how was the process for you?
Yeah, so very long, kind of painstaking. I didn't read 100,000 letters. I got to about a little over 2,000, which may not sound like a lot in the grand scheme of things, but in the archives took quite a bit of time. A lot of them are handwritten, so I spent a lot of time learning how to read German handwriting from that era. And I picked out about 30 soldiers of the Wehrmacht that I follow, soldiers who fought across different parts of the Eastern Front. Tried to get a group of guys who is generally representative of the composition of the Wehrmacht, so mostly younger, kind of in their young 20s, mostly Protestants, some Catholics as well, kind of reflecting the general makeup of German society. And you're absolutely right. Most of the content of the letters has to do with, "Hello, Mom, I'm doing okay. Please send me cigarettes. Please send food." I actually have this theory that the German army, till a fair extent, is supplied by its mother sending food.
We never include that in the logistics chain, though, do we? The importance of the mother economy. But every nation. Socks, chocolate.
There's a mother economy in the Vermont.
We'll have to call up Adam Tooze and say his next book should be about the analyzing of the mother in World War II logistical support. It's an untapped subject, but
I think it would be fascinating. Yeah, but so a lot of this comes down to reading through letters, and the nice thing about this archive is they have lots of letters from the same soldier. So one guy, I might have up to 300 letters from him, which is really important because in a lot of other studies, you get excerpts. So you might have, half a letter from this guy, half a letter from that guy, and that's what you're going off of. But I had enough material to get a more complete picture of each man, his worldview, how Nazi was he? What did he believe? What was he doing? And there's also a lot of biographical information that the archives had. So that helped me a lot. But the process of going through the letters, it's a slow one of, reading through them and filtering out, for the subjects I was most interested in. So, I didn't care about the cigarettes too much, but when they start talking about atrocities they're committing or, the morality of the war, that's where I really got interested.
And that's, of course, what we're going to be discussing now. So that's great lead in there, David. That was super. We're getting some questions in already, and I guess we'll address this one during. But Ian Carr is saying about with Wehrmacht units and individuals moving from front to front. Once infected, is there evidence the attitude was something that was carried over? So I guess we're going to go into that kind of changing perception of the war around them, because, even the classic war films, I'm thinking the German-made Stalingrad film, they're all optimistic and keen at the beginning, and then you see the process of them understanding what it is, the regime they're fighting for, and so on. So, and I like the idea of the fact you went and looked at lots of letters by the same individual, because we know there have been books in the past, so if you cherry pick one line from one letter written in 1 month, you can make it kind of say whatever you want to say. You can make it support an idea or go against an idea. But looking at them over the course of I guess, an entire war, you can see them and monitor this changing attitude. But anyway, let's move in and dive in. So the topics we're going to be discussing, which are the topics also in your book, and folks, I will get the plug in right away. The link to buy David's book is in the description below. It's out right now, or it's coming out now, depending on which bookshop, which country you're in. David's going to hold up a copy of there. My copy is on its way now from an internet retailer. So what are we going to try? What were the topics of your research, and what are the topics of the book, and what are the topics for tonight?
Yeah, thank you. So these are, it's not exhaustive, but these are kind of some of the high points that my research hits. The first one is the moral psychology of the German soldier. So what was the soldier thinking of himself and ideas about right and wrong. Next is the nature of the Wehrmacht. So especially the question of how Nazified was it, which is a topic that's a huge one in the historiography, but also what other sorts of value systems are floating around besides Nazism. The relationship between the front and the home front is another big one. I think a lot of historians look at them as completely separate, but my research tries to bring them together. So I show how the things the soldiers are doing and what they're writing about in their letters is going to influence perceptions back in the homeland. Also, lots about interactions with Soviet civilians, so how individual soldiers, but also the institution of the Wehrmacht, behaves around Soviet civilians and treats Soviet civilians. Often a pretty dark story, of course. And then finally, this overarching question of ideology and morality in the Third Reich. And when the Nazis come to power, does the entire moral system of the country shift overnight? How does morality change in the Wehrmacht because of the Nazis? And overall, I'd say my general perspective is trying to write a moral history of the Wehrmacht on the Eastern Front. And someone had asked the question about ideas carrying over to other fronts. Unfortunately, I just focus on the Eastern Front, so I haven't looked at other places. I use the Eastern Front because it's where the majority of soldiers were fighting, and it's also where the memory of the war really gets centered for the Germans. Although, kind of my general perception is soldiers who fought on the Eastern Front tended to take an Eastern Front mentality with them to other fronts, and so some of the atrocities you see in the West are from units that had spent a lot of time in the East, kind of fighting a different type of war. But in any case, you can go to the next slide.
Yeah, and this is the thing. This is the meat of the subject tonight. Is the clean Wehrmacht myth and where it originated and who started it, and is it a German thing? And now, of course, we have a worldwide. We are right now. We are beaming to people in however many countries are watching us, and how many will watch it, and everybody has their own kind of cultural and historiographical idea of what the Nazis were about and the Wehrmacht. But this is about, again, as we all research, it's about the people at the time within Germany, civilians, the military, and where this idea came from. So, it's great stuff. So, over to you, and then I will jump in with my usual comments and questions.
Sounds great. So there are a couple of background pieces you need to understand my research, and the first one is this myth that Paul is mentioning. So the myth of the Wehrmacht, which is very, very popular after the war, it's how most Germans viewed the history of the Wehrmacht, was that the Wehrmacht was a virtuous, upstanding, honorable institution that fought essentially a conventional war on the Eastern Front and other fronts, had kept its distance from the Nazi regime, was essentially apolitical in nature. And the individual soldier was a good guy, a decent guy, an upstanding guy, hadn't committed any crimes, hadn't really done anything wrong. And that is the picture of the Wehrmacht that is really solidified in German society ever since the end of the war. A lot of it's propagated by veterans, generals writing their memoirs, people like Manstein, giving a particular account of the history and leaving out the darker aspects of the Wehrmacht's past. You also had the fact that a lot of the Wehrmacht's archival documents ended up in the United States for study. And so there are a couple of decades when German historians couldn't get their hands on all the records. So that kind of contributes to a vacuum in historical knowledge. For the vast majority of soldiers were never prosecuted for war crimes. There are like a handful of generals who get prosecuted, but at the Nuremberg trials, it was decided that the Wehrmacht was not a criminal organization. It was a kind of unlike the SS. So there's this narrative that, the Wehrmacht, generally decent guys, pretty normal guys, in contrast to, say, the SS or the Gestapo.
And I think, I'm not going to jump in and join in your research here, but I think in a way the Allies contributed to that idea as well, because it was it was better for us in 1945 to think that by separating the bad guys with the SS, the Gestapo, those guys manning the concentration camps, we can kind of treat them and deal with them. But the rest of them, because they're going back home, they're part of the refugee columns we're looking after. We can't. Let's separate them and let's conveniently kind of say that they were the good guys, because otherwise we're allowing ourselves to think that bad guys are getting away with it. So I think the Allies were part of the construction as well.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. I think a lot of it comes down to the Cold War. So the British and the Americans see West Germany as an ally in the Cold War against communism, and they encourage, especially the Americans, encourage the West Germans to build up the Bundeswehr, the new German army, to be a kind of bulwark against the communists. And within that environment, people didn't want to focus on the crimes of the past. This is supposed to be a brand new army with a kind of a clean sheet. And even like President Eisenhower in the US talks about how, the average German soldier wasn't so bad. That's kind of part of this rehabilitation of the army. Politicians in Germany, like Adenauer, are talking about how honorable the German soldier was. And historians, I think, in Britain and the US, partially play a role in generating this myth in a lot of early histories, A.J.P. Taylor, Little Hart. They write conventional histories of the war, where the Wehrmacht appears as a normal army. It's fighting in a essentially honorable way, and it's all about just the operational history. And there's nothing in there about the darker side of the Wehrmacht. So this myth persists for decades and decades. It's really only into kind of the 1990s that, at least in Germany, the public starts to accept a different, a more realistic version of events. What historians have found is that the innocent, clean Wehrmacht is a myth. And decades and decades of research going back to really the late 1960s by German historians, American historians, British historians, lots and lots of people has completely overturned this idea of the clean Wehrmacht. We know now that instead of being an apolitical organization, the Wehrmacht had very close ties with the Nazi regime, especially its upper leadership was kind of infected by Nazi ideology, but even down to the ordinary soldier. And the war that it was fighting on the Eastern Front is now seen not as a conventional conflict, but a war of extermination, racially inspired by the Nazis' racial ideology. This is a war that at the outset is kind of advertised as a way of destroying racial enemies. It's the Jewish Bolsheviks, who supposedly rule the Soviet Union, are going to be annihilated in this conflict. Any subhuman Slavs of the population will either be starved or turned into slave laborers. So this is really part of the Holocaust, part of this larger racial project of the Nazi regime to transform the racial map of Europe with the Nazi, with the German race on the top, and everybody else, especially the Jews, are going to be crushed beneath it. So that's the way that the campaign is portrayed to soldiers through what are called the criminal orders. These are orders that are issued at the beginning of the campaign, telling soldiers that they don't have to follow the rules of war on the Eastern Front, that Russian commissars, so political appointees in the Russian army, will be executed on sight. Prisoners are not going to be treated well. The army is part of a larger plan to sort of despoil the region of resources. So, millions of Soviets are expected to starve to death because the Wehrmacht is going to live off the land and take the resources for itself to kind of spare the German people any kind of hardship when it comes to food. And in terms of the Wehrmacht's actions during the war, lots of historians have written about this. People like Omer Bartov, Stephen Fritz, Wayman Bourne, Jeffrey McGargy, about The crimes of the Wehrmacht. It's a long list. I can't, talk about all of it right now, but about 16 million Soviet civilians die in this conflict. The Wehrmacht destroys something like 70,000 villages. It starves to death over 3 million Soviet prisoners of war. A lot of Soviet soldiers are just killed immediately and not even taken prisoner. The treatment of the civilian population is terroristic. There is a kind of standard policy that if anybody resisted, if anyone looked wrong at a German soldier, that person and perhaps their entire family and maybe the entire village would be just wiped off the map. And in these pictures, you can see on the left is an execution of suspected partisans. So the partisan war behind the lines leads to a kind of mass murder of civilians. You had theft on an enormous scale. And a word about that, theft on the Eastern Front is a little bit different than in other places because the Soviet population is already barely subsisting.
Yep.
And so when the German army comes in and soldiers start to take what they want, this creates mass starvation across the Eastern Front. The picture on the right is illustrating scorched earth tactics. So a lot of times when the Wehrmacht retreated, it would systematically burn everything, houses, livestock, just left a path of destruction as part of its strategy.
Well, just interrupt you for a second, David, because you're saying we now know that these we all know about these crimes. There's, as you said, you could list the authors who've tackled it. We could list the incidents. We could list the books that talk about it. And yet, even already, and there's been a little bit of comment on the sidebar about, but what about the Russians and what about the Allied murders? I think there is still, although we know this, there is still some people. There are going to be a group of people who will go, yeah, but what about that? Be the answer to everything, and that's why what your book is doing is important. Why I like to think what I'm doing here is important as well, because if we can just convert one person through watching this show to just question what they think about the Wehrmacht and maybe can double take about their picture of a tiger tank on the wall of their den or whatever it would be, and just think, hang on, or they're talking about a German commander or whatever it would be, then we're doing well here. But let's it's brilliant stuff. We'll move through the PowerPoint, and it's really I'm really enjoying it, David. So keep going. Brilliant stuff.
Sounds good. And the last point I want to make about the reality is also the Wehrmacht is part of the Holocaust on the Eastern Front. The SS Einsatzgruppen are doing most of the killing of Jews, but the Wehrmacht is providing all sorts of support to them to make this possible. And there are Wehrmacht units that are directly involved in mass murder of Jews. So with that as the background, that's the background of all of my research is this reality. When I started looking at soldiers' letters, one of the biggest surprises was how they saw themselves. And what they wrote about themselves seemed to have little or nothing to do with what we know about the campaign. So I'll read these couple of quotes. One of the soldiers I study wrote, and now the Germans are here, and the people can always see for themselves that the Germans are decent, nice guys. Next guy, let all of our previous wars be as they may, just or unjust, let them be the machinations of diplomats. One thing, however, is certain. This war against the criminal work of Bolshevism is the battle for a righteous cause. And there are many, many more examples of this sort of thinking among the German troops. So you can go to the next slide.
So they are, the dates of them. They're both post Barbarossa, aren't they? They're both, things have already been happening that are not very nice. I mean, it's not like this is on the way to the east. This is after things have happened. So
yeah, for the most part. Actually, one of those quotes was, I think, the day the invasion starts.
Okay.
But most of the time, it's a few months later that they start saying this. So this leads to the three big topics that I cover in my research. The first one is it's basically now that all the crimes of the Wehrmacht have been established, how do the bad guys of World War II apparently convince themselves that they were the good guys? So this is, how do they sleep at night? Why didn't they express remorse either during the war or after the war? So it's this kind of moral exploration of the mindset of the German soldier. That's the first one. Second question is, what was the Wehrmacht's moral landscape? So what's the moral context in which these soldiers are sort of swimming? What are the value systems in the Wehrmacht, and how do they influence its actions and its deeds, its words and its deeds? And especially, to what extent has it kind of taken over into this Nazi value system rather than other value systems?
And I'm guessing this is where your initial work into the religion aspect kind of comes into, because morality, religion,
Yes.
the two are inexplicably connected, and you know, we would might define people from that era as if you were a teenager during the Nazi era, your only influence about your morality is Nazism. But of course, there's the dreaded word family values, there's religion, there's national identity, there's cultural, there's local identity from where you are in Germany, whether you're part of a hunting fraternity, are you part of a city, are you, there's many things that would influence someone's moral compass. And I'm really pleased that you've tackled this on a much broader than just define them as either Nazis or not Nazis, because that's too binary, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm going to talk in a little bit about some of those other influences that you see besides Nazism. And third question, if you go back to the previous slide for one second, is where did the Wehrmacht myth come from? And it looks like that has nothing to do with the other two questions, but I will hopefully prove that it does, in fact. Thank you. You can go to the next one now. So this is where the morality comes up. And there are a couple of concepts I kind of want to get out of the way so people understand the research. The first one is Nazi morality. So most people, I think, tend to see the Nazis as amoral. They didn't believe in anything, kind of nihilistic, right? Just sort of evil for the sake of being evil. But recently, there are a lot of historians like Claudia Kuhns who have talked about the Nazis having a kind of moral system. It's a very twisted one. It's not one that we would recognize today, and it's based on race and the idea that whatever helps the Aryan race is a good thing. Whatever destroys the enemies of the Aryan race is a good thing. And so it's a kind of reframing of morality around racial lines. And if you're a Jew, you need to be destroyed because you're a Jew, because you're not of the correct race. That's how Nazi morality operates. So that's going to be one major influence on the Wehrmacht. And then on the other side here, we have what I call more traditional morality. So ideas of right and wrong that are older than Nazism. Things like the Ten Commandments, the Golden Rule, just the value of human life, middle class morality, middle class norms, the importance of family, the importance of nation, patriotism. You've got the military honor code, which has been around for centuries. And one of my questions is, what happens to this military honor code in the Wehrmacht? Is it still there, or is it just completely gone by this point? The idea of treating innocent people with respect, following the rules of war. You don't shoot at medics or people trying to surrender. You take care of prisoners. That's the military honor code. You also have ideas about what makes a just war. So, just like in the US, in Germany in the 1940s, and earlier than that, there's a concept that war is okay as long as you're waging it for the right reasons and, protecting the innocent. So that's going to play into this traditional morality. And then finally, there's a concept that an author named Isabel Hull has written a lot about called military necessity, that really creeps into the German army, which is, it's kind of like its own independent moral system, very pragmatic. It's the idea that if it helps you to win the war, then it's good. If it makes it harder to win the war, then it's bad. With the assumption being that if you win the war decisively and quickly, then you've spared casualties, and this is a more kind of humane way of doing things. So that's going to be a big influence, especially on the officer corps. And these two types of moral systems, Nazi morality and traditional morality, have a very interesting, very complex relationship. Sometimes they are diametrically opposed, but sometimes they kind of bleed into each other. And I find in a lot of cases, soldiers will kind of make their way from traditional morality into Nazi morality. Because there's a kind of relationship. For example, if you're a soldier and you really believe in the value of comradeship, which is a big part of the military honor code, well, you could start to see that circle of comrades as your racial, your racial brothers, and get into more of a Nazi understanding of community. So I'm not necessarily saying that these two things are completely opposed to each other. But you can go to the next slide.
And now this is the letters, and this just when you sent me this the PowerPoint, and I was trying to read that, and I was like, yeah, okay, that's going to give me a headache. I mean, it's just hats off to you for doing that.
Yep, that is a letter in the main archive in Berlin that I worked at. You can tell the handwriting. Actually, this guy has pretty good handwriting compared to a lot of them. You have to kind of learn each guy's handwriting to be able to understand it. And even now, looking at it, I have to study more to read it in front of you. So soldiers' letters were my main source, kind of this core sample of 30 men. But unlike a lot of other historians who have looked into the men, I wanted to look into the context, the institutional context. So I also spent a lot of time at the military archive, looking at propaganda sources, looking at records from the units that these men were in. So orders that are issued, lots of intelligence reports about the mood of the population, chaplains' reports to look at religion. So I try to kind of situate the letters within this larger context. And then finally, I had sources from the home front, things like Nazi Party records and some letters written from the home front to the front, newspapers, things like that, because I see soldiers as being embedded within their institution, but also within their larger society. So you can take it to the next slide.
And just very, you can answer this as a yes or no, but did the kind of correlation between the content of letters and the dates of particular sort of campaigns and things going well or better in the Eastern Front and the feeling of the home front, did they kind of correlate and connect? Could you see these kind of mood changes as across these sources?
That's a good question. I'd say in general, they get more and more depressed and kind of downtrodden as the war goes on. A lot of the initial letters are very optimistic, and German victory is assured and that sort of thing. And you see soldiers slowly realizing that this isn't really the campaign they thought it was going to be, and so you get more into kind of a victimhood mentality, or a mentality of how things aren't going great, especially after the Battle of Stalingrad, I would say. In terms of letters from the home to the front, that's harder to say. I haven't seen as many, but I did read one report that said the letters going from the front to the home front were more positive and optimistic than the letters from home to the front. It's because civilians were starting to kind of lose faith in the war, I suppose.
Which kind of connects to what you were saying about the kind of the way the military works things. This idea that everybody in the unit thinks this is normal because you're part of a big structure that's following a procedure. So it's where civilians perhaps a bit more cynical naturally. I don't know, but this is another tangent. But anyway, this is one of your maps. You have several of these on your website, so I'll play it. But before I play it, what were you trying to achieve with these animated maps?
So in trying to study these 30 guys who are fighting across all different parts of the front, I ran into just enormous problems figuring out who is where at what time. And I ended up getting a program called ArcGIS that some people might be familiar with, and kind of spending a lot of time using the letters and other sources to try to piece together where each guy was at a given moment in time. And so on this map, you see all of the soldiers or most of the soldiers. And as you play it, the time scale at the top is going to move, and they're going to start to invade the Soviet Union. So this is getting into the summer of 1941. You see people moving toward Moscow very rapidly. And then things are going to stall out in the winter.
And we did discuss this. Philip Blood, the result of his last book was all about this technology, and he gave us kind of a masterclass in how the whole thing works. So I'd like to think that the audience kind of are on board with this idea now. So it's.
I'll have to watch that. Yeah, and you can see this is the Operation Blue going towards Stalingrad in 1942. And then from this point on, it's really the slow retreat across the Ukraine. And you'll start to see a lot of the dots not moving anymore. That's because the soldiers are dead.
Right.
I might have to change the map so they disappear or something.
They'll put a little cross over them or something, or other gravestone. But and Philip Blood is an absolute I can't think of the word I'm looking for. Fanatic about this combining of mapping and archives to create a kind of a visual idea of following atrocities in his case, and in your case, following individual soldiers. It's extraordinary work.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it just made it a lot easier to tell who is doing what at what time, and that helped a lot with writing.
And again, it gives you a sense of place, and you can connect to the campaigns, because when we had David Starlow, I know you know David, talking about Barbarossa. I mean, when we're talking about an event that's involving literally millions over such a wide area, your brain is trying to kind of contend with the vastness of the Eastern Front and how different it can be across that front. When we've talked about Turkey's neutrality and how the Barbarossa is affecting even kind of the Mediterranean and as far up as Scandinavia. The first push into Eastern Europe is just absolutely monumentally huge, and it needs something like this to kind of remind us of the scale of it. So that was brilliant. So let's move on to the histography, because that's one of my favorite words of the last 18 months or so. So over to you again, David.
Yeah, so historiography is the history of history, right? So the history of how historians have written about a subject. I don't want to spend too much time on this, but here I've written down kind of the basic answers that other historians have given to some of my questions. So with the question of, how did soldiers rationalize their participation in this criminal conflict? Really in the English language literature, Omer Bartov is kind of the main guy here. And his thesis is that Nazi ideology, or you could say Nazi morality, is really what soldiers rely on to justify their actions. So that essentially they think they're the good guys because they are so indoctrinated. So I'm going to have a slightly different answer. With the second one, again, ideology is generally seen as the biggest sort of moral influence in the Wehrmacht by a lot of historians today. I mean, look at the criminal orders and what the army did certainly fits pretty closely to Nazi ideology. But there are historians who also mention that the army is pretty pragmatic. It doesn't always do what the Nazis want it. It can deviate a little bit, and older values are still in there to some extent, but usually not seen as dominant. And then finally, where did the myth come from? Most historians say that this is a post-war phenomenon. So it begins in 1945 and continues afterwards. So you can go on to the next slide. So I wanted to give you a preview of my answers up front. Otherwise, the rest of this talk will be a little hard to follow. For the question of how did soldiers, come up with this idea that they were the good guys, I answer it as it's partially ideology, but it's also traditional morality. Soldiers are going to find justifications from all sorts of different places, all sorts of moral systems, in an effort to maintain this idea that they are the good guys fighting for a righteous cause. And a lot of my work is figuring out how they did that. For the second question, I see the Wehrmacht as heavily influenced by Nazi morality, but also traditional values. A lot of those value systems I talked about before, like the military honor code, I see them as still being part of the Wehrmacht and influencing its activities. And that makes the Wehrmacht a more strange kind of institution than people have seen. One that will be able to hand out candy to children and then burn down the village the next day.
Yeah. And in a weird way, David, almost a stronger morality, because the SS, those we think of as the absolute fervent Nazis, their ideology is still new. It's still only a decade plus old.
Right.
If you can, within the Wehrmacht, incorporate legends going back to previous eras, Christianity, Abrahamic religion, and everything, and reinforce. I mean, as we know, the Germans went to war with the Gott means God is with us belt buckle. If you can tie it all together as one package, I'm kind of thinking it's actually almost a stronger package to believe in if you're a 19-year-old soldier than the pure Nazi.
I would absolutely agree. And you're already kind of preempting one of my big.
I do that. It's because I'm operating on a high intelligent plane. No, it's a lucky guess, but no, it's
Yeah, I completely agree. I think the Wehrmacht is stronger because it is not 100% Nazi, which seems a little bit strange in hindsight, but it's because it's able to appeal to soldiers of all kinds of different backgrounds, all different beliefs, even ones who aren't convinced Nazis. If your institution is 100% Nazi, what do you do about the guys who aren't, who don't quite buy into that ideology? But if you're able to say, hey, we're good Christians on a crusade.
Yeah, I mean, and that's the thing, isn't it? I know from the cemeteries in Normandy that the majority of Germans buried there are either Lutherans or Catholics. I mean, that was the predominant faith, and we're talking in the high 90s percentage. Whereas those who voted for Hitler is a percentage. So the bigger percentage of people you can bring on board, then theoretically the stronger the base you've got. And if most people in Germany had a religious ideology of their own that they've been instilled from childhood and tradition, and build on that, it's worryingly dangerous and worryingly scary.
It is. The whole project ends up pretty scary. But I see the Wehrmacht as being stronger and scarier because of these different value systems. And then finally, for the question of the myth, I argue that it's actually the soldiers themselves, especially writing their letters, and they write about 10 billion letters home during the war, who are actually creating the myth. They are kind of distorting the view of what they're doing. They're presenting themselves in a certain way, and that is the predominant perspective that the home front gets. And so after the war, there are a couple of changes to the myth, but most of the pieces are already in place. People already believe the myth before the last shot is fired. And that's what's going to make it so powerful.
And this is why your book is so important. And of course, we can't, as you said at the beginning, we need to understand that there's the enemy point of view as well. And there will be the point we get to in a minute in the PowerPoint about but what about? Because it'll already be happening, but what about? Because we're talking about an enemy on the Eastern Front that in a lot of ways were ideologically just as shitty as the guys we're talking about. But that's a separate subject. That's the point. You can tackle one without having to bring the other one in, I think, is the point you're making.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I would say two wrongs don't make a right. Just because the Soviets were committing atrocities, and they were, doesn't mean that the Germans weren't. But so views of the enemy. So this is, I think, one of the easiest topics to tackle first on a kind of moral level. So what did Germans think about the kind of moral status of their enemy? And what I've found through letters is you have an interesting combination of ideological views. So portraying the Red Army as this sort of Mongolian or Asian horde of inferior races, and that's why they need to be destroyed. Especially Jews are portrayed as just, the enemy through and through. But you have a combination of that with more kind of traditional moral argumentation, is what I call it. So a lot of soldiers focus on atrocities that the Red Army commits. They talk about how the Soviets are executing German prisoners, or they, let's see, I think I have a quote from one soldier about this. Yeah, here's one guy. He says the Soviets show white flags. One approaches and then they shoot. Many soldiers have already lost their lives here this way. My favorite quote from a soldier about the enemy is the Bolsheviks do not want love. No, they hate it. The Russians do not know and do not want Christmas. So you have this ideological argument about the racial inferiority of these people alongside the idea that the Soviet army is just a horrible institution with people who they're ignoring the laws of war, they're shooting at medics, they are dressing up in civilian clothing and shooting us in the back, fighting dishonorably. And so this is where you get, you can sort of go your ideological route, or you could go with your run-of-the-mill, these are just terrible people, or some combination of both is how they are looking at their opponents. You can go to the next slide here. So that's kind of covering the Red Army, but in terms of the sort of the social and economic and political situation of the USSR, soldiers are describing the Soviet regime as both a horrific Jewish Bolshevik experiment and a kind of moral catastrophe where the people are in poverty, the rulers have taken all the money. They talk about the famines of the earlier Soviet years. People are starving to death. And here's a propaganda photo on the right of, I think it's from Kiev by one of the German propaganda companies, showing in the background, this is where the Soviet party members are meeting in this wonderful building, and then in the front is where the workers are in these horrible huts. And soldiers will actually go around talking to civilians and learning about, what was it like living under the Soviets. And I call it a kind of moral research project. They're like doing research on how bad the enemy was, and then writing home about it to their families. And in German propaganda in the Wehrmacht, like in newspapers written for the troops, you get this idea constantly that the enemy it's racially inferior, but it's also morally inferior. And on the left there, that is a book, German Soldiers See the Soviet Union, that was actually written during the war. It's like a collection of soldiers' letters about just how horrific and unequal the Soviet Union is. So here we see this combination of traditional morality and Nazi morality to justify what is happening.
Scary.
So now we move on to, if that's what they thought of the enemy, what did they think of themselves? What did they write about themselves? And this is a self-portrait. I don't know how, but one of the soldiers I study, Hans Albring, who's a committed Catholic, he liked drawing, and he somehow had the time to draw this in, I think, 1942. But anyway, so what do soldiers write about themselves? Well, unlike their view of the enemy, it's extremely positive. So they are drawing both from, again, Nazi ideology, talking about how they're faithful followers of the Führer and how, they're good members of the Volksgemeinschaft, the racial community, on the one hand, and then also falling back on all kinds of other value systems, talking about how great they are as comrades, they're selfless, they're brave, they're honorable. Unlike the Soviets, they fight in a straightforward manner, they follow the rules, they're not, dressing up in civilian clothing. They are, honorable people. And one of the things that was most striking that I saw in the archives is, in some cases, I would open up a letter and there was a flower in it, like a dried flower from 1942 or something. Because soldiers were sending flowers back home to their wives, or their sweethearts. They're sending gifts back home, and they're generally kind of keeping up this this impression that they're good fathers, they're good brothers, they're good family men, they're good comrades, they're donating to charity, they're good people. Right. So this is where a lot of the honorable Wehrmacht is coming
but without going down a very, very dangerous political discussion about today, we know this is how the world operates. People who are on the right or wrong or yes or no side of anti-vax, whatever it would be now, when you think you are on the side of right, you think you are on the side of right. All of us fall into one of those categories. So it's fascinating this environment, especially as we said, we're going back to this idea of drawing on the faith of their family, their traditional German, whatever you want to call it, Prussian values, all that kind of stuff. There, it's a very, very strong base to start off. So once you've convinced yourself you're on the right side, that it's very difficult to be dissuaded of that.
Yes, absolutely. And I do connect this to a kind of universal human desire to be the good guy. I read a lot of social psychology, and if you go to any prison and you ask someone, are you a criminal? You usually get a response that, no, I'm a good guy and I robbed that bank because, and here's.
Or even in prison, the denial. I mean, is it? I think it's the beginning of Shawshank Redemption. Is if you speak to anybody here, they all say they were stuffed by their lawyers. No one's here. No one actually did the crime. There's always it wasn't me. It was so. That I think is natural, isn't it? And I was going to say at the beginning of the show, I'm glad you brought it up. It seems to me that the result of your book, you'd have to have an understanding of psychology and morality and religion as well, because just understanding this on purely military terms is not going to get you anywhere near close enough to understanding how this shared collective experience these people are going to is shaping their attitude. You've got to understand how the old gray matter works, and just brilliant stuff. I'm thoroughly. I'm not going to say enjoying it because it's in some ways a grim subject, but I'm enjoying the learning process.
Thanks. So that's a little bit about that self-concept, and this quotation here is from a newspaper for the troops, so written by Wehrmacht propagandists, read by members of the army. The cultured world knows that the German soldier at every time and in every place fights openly and honestly. Defamations cannot dissuade him from the decency of his way of fighting. So it's not just the soldiers' letters, it's propaganda within the Wehrmacht that is propagating this idea of the decency of the German soldier, but also how the German soldier is a good Nazi at the same time. And those aren't necessarily seen as contradictory. No, so this slide, this gets into more the institutional fabric of the Wehrmacht. And one of the most striking things that I saw is, again, it's not just the soldiers who are kind of creating this veneer of righteousness and justification. You also see it in the orders that are given out. So this is Panzer Group of 3. It's kind of the intelligence section of the 3rd Panzer Group, writing that events of the last days provide renewed occasion to emphasize that the troops must unconditionally behave correctly toward the civilian population. The trust of the population toward the German Wehrmacht and their happiness at being liberated from the Soviet regime, interesting choice of words, should not be reversed into the opposite through incorrect or unfortunate conduct on the part of the troops or the organizations connected to the army. And this is one of many, many different formations that issue orders and directives telling troops to comport themselves in a decent manner, to fight honorably, to treat the innocent, women and children with dignity and respect. At the same time, a lot of these same orders are telling troops to have no mercy toward the Jews, toward the communists, and if any civilian looks at you wrong, execute them immediately. So you have this very schizophrenic message. You have the ideology, and that is, that's the dominant part of Wehrmacht's modus operandi is terror toward the population. But then you get these orders telling soldiers to be honorable, which is very strange.
It's paradoxical and strange, and
incredibly
I don't know what to say
paradoxical
about it. And of course, as we move on, and it's going to come up, and it's already come up on the sidebar to a limited extent, is that, but again, we said earlier that, but what about the Soviets are just worse? And again, crimes aren't crime. Well, I'll let you talk about your own slide here, but that's going to come up, and it's going to come up with those watching this show live. I'm sure it's going to come up in comments over the next few weeks and months as people discover it, and the Wehrmachts and the others kind of start coming out of the woodwork and saying, but. I don't know why they would feel the need to defend the Wehrmacht. That's the thing. I don't understand where it's come from. This idea we know there was massacres on a widespread level. We know that all these units are. It's not just implicated. They are guilty, proven, case closed. What's the beef? So I'll hand back to you.
Yeah, to those people, I guess I would say. Go into the archives, learn a bit of German, go into the archives, and you can see for yourself or take a look at the research that's been done. But in any case,
and buy your book. You're allowed to say that, David. Buy your damn book. Yeah, plug your yeah.
Yeah, that too. So this next slide here is about atrocities, and I have a whole chapter on soldiers writing about their own atrocities. Also atrocities committed by the Soviets. And I was kind of shocked that any soldier would write home to his mother and tell her that he had, just wiped out a village that day. But you actually see it very frequently in soldiers' letters, talking about theft, executions of civilians, prisoners being executed or mistreated. Jews, some of them do talk rather openly about the Holocaust and what they've witnessed. And what I've found, however, is they're not really trying to incriminate themselves. They're trying to justify themselves. And so very frequently they'll talk about something they did. Maybe I stole. There's a guy named Harold Hoffman who writes about stealing the last potatoes from a Russian lady and her children in the middle of winter, which he knows is like a death sentence. But he provides a kind of explanation, which is his unit didn't have a lot of supplies. They were hungry, and that's why we did it. He doesn't, he says he feels bad about it, but he offers some kind of justification. So writing about your atrocities becomes a way of defending your image as a decent man. And so on the left, I've listed a few of the ways in which soldiers are justifying themselves. A lot of their letters, and maybe this has come up in chat, but they talk about how, we execute prisoners because the Soviets executed our prisoners, or we destroyed the village because there are partisans who attacked us and a couple of soldiers died. So there's a lot of this, I call it kind of like playground morality. It's like, the other kid did it first. Therefore I did it. This idea of it's, justice in their minds is how they often represent it.
But it is interesting, the fact that you were surprised. Well, I'm surprised they were actually writing about it. But the conclusion I'm drawing is it must be justification. If they didn't think they did do anything wrong, why would they feel the need to kind of elaborate it? Why would you tell your mum about something bad you did, unless you are trying to do it as a process to justify it? You just ignore it, wouldn't you? It's a fascinating insight into what's going through these individuals' heads. Yeah.
Yeah, and in terms of these justifications, and what I'm kind of saying in this chapter is a lot of the justifications they offer are kind of more traditional run-of-the-mill moral arguments with some ideology mixed in. But it's really coming up with any kind of argument that makes the most sense to that soldier.
And is that why, because Ian Carr brought up the subject of censorship again, is that why these comments are getting through? Is because the censors are thinking that the justification has therefore worked, so we might as well leave it in because it's backing our own story. Is that what? Because you would only censor it if you didn't.
So that's a really good question. And I spent a lot of time kind of reading the regulations that the censors followed. And there were censors in the German army. there weren't a lot of them. If we're talking about 10 billion letters, they read, some tiny fraction of that.
Right.
But of course, your average soldier would know that, yes, his letters could be open.
Could be. There's always the risk that it will be. Yeah.
As far as atrocities go, so what I found is the censors were not, they weren't looking for that. They weren't told to censor soldiers from talking about these sorts of things. They were mostly there to root out defeatist sentiment or criticism of the Nazi regime, or giving away kind of operational details, we're going to attack tomorrow at 5 a.m. And this is an army that issues orders at the beginning of the campaign that we're not going to follow the rules of war. So my impression is the censors didn't really care about this, or perhaps the justifications helped too. But so many soldiers wrote about this that it seems like they just kind of didn't care about the censors, or didn't think the censors would mind this. I've read some reports where the censors, they kind of show which letters they picked out to go and prosecute this soldier. And I've never seen anyone who is prosecuted for talking about German atrocities. The closest thing I've seen is there's one unit that issues an order that you can't take pictures of the mass murder of Jews because they don't want evidence of that floating around. That's a very good question. And yeah, censors and letters are a very interesting topic. But here, I don't have to go through all of these, but I'd say the most compelling and the grayest area of atrocities is when soldiers talk about how they're starving, they're hungry, they don't have enough supplies, and that's why they had to steal, the last chickens from a Soviet family. And there, it is really quite a gray area. Although, I don't know of any German soldiers who actually starved to death in the campaign, and they were getting their own supplies from Germany. But besides that, you see all sorts of euphemisms. You see soldiers saying that, we didn't really steal. It was given to us freely. That's one of my favorites. We were really friends with the population. We weren't stealing. Military necessity. So arguing that, we had to destroy the village because it's, we had to stop the Soviets from getting those.
It's saving other German lives. It's yeah.
So overall, the picture, and then you also have ideology, and ideology comes in especially when they're justifying the killing of Jews, which happens sometimes. But for the most part, I was actually very surprised that most of the rationalizations I saw weren't really ideological in nature. It was more of this kind of run-of-the-mill sort of excuses and justifications that could have worked in the First World War. And I think part of that, it doesn't necessarily mean the soldiers weren't ideologically influenced, but it might mean that they thought these arguments would make more sense to their parents in the homeland. And if they just wrote, we exterminated, the population here because they're subhumans, and that's what you do to subhumans. You don't really see soldiers saying that, except for a few cases with Jewish victims, where they are really singled out. So you can go to the next slide.
And here's the heady topic of religion.
Yep. So religion, definitely a backbone of German moral thinking. Like you mentioned before, I've seen a figure of like 95% of Germans identified as Christians.
Yeah, it's huge
during the war. So it's almost everybody. I mean, there are gradations. So there's some soldiers who are extremely Catholic or go to church every day, and then there are a lot more who are more kind of cultural Christians who they might. I don't know, they pray once in a while or something like that, but they're not very involved in religion. And this is a campaign that's being fought against the atheists, right? So the Soviet Union is an officially atheist country. On the left-hand side there, you see a picture. Do you know what that is, Paul? Any guesses?
No, I don't.
That is a church, inside of a church with factory machinery. So what the Soviets did was they took most of the churches in the country and turned them into factories, warehouses, dance halls and cinemas, or burned them down, sent a lot of priests to Siberia, and generally just suppressed religion in the Soviet Union. And the Germans knew about this, at least the general idea. And so when the war starts, a lot of propaganda, even coming all the way from Joseph Goebbels, emphasizes the godlessness of the Soviets and the need to destroy this regime it's both, it's Jewish and Bolshevist, and it's also atheist. And the German churches get on board with the campaign. They issue statements saying, we support this attack against communist godlessness. The chaplains who are marching in the ranks of the Wehrmacht are oftentimes really motivated by this kind of crusade idea that we're going to crush communism. But it's also going to turn into a more kind of positive idea. But let's stop for a second and look at this cartoon. This is one of my favorite things I found in Wehrmacht propaganda. So this is actually the Archbishop of Canterbury on the left-hand side, blessing Joseph Stalin, who is like honorary godless guy #1. So the propagandists of the Wehrmacht made a huge deal out of the fact that the Americans and the British are supporting the Soviet Union and the Soviets, and that's Stalin with his axe, and I think he's like murdered a couple of priests. I think that's what they're supposed to be in the background. They're holding services to pray for the Soviet Union, and this is what the Soviet Union does to Christians. So this whole notion of crusade becomes a big part of the justification. This kind of turning the invasion into a race.
It's not like there's any historical precedent for crusades in the name of religion, is there? He said in a sarcastic way.
First one. And one of the extraordinary things that happens when German soldiers enter the country is they find all these churches, right, that the Soviets had shut down, and they start to reopen them. And I've actually written an article about this. They get together with chaplains and they clean out the churches, sometimes with the population's help, and then they hold worship services for the first time in 20 years. And you see these extraordinary scenes of German soldiers worshiping side by side with Russian civilians or Ukrainians or whoever in these churches, and declaring this to be a crusade, not only to destroy the atheist Soviet Union, but to bring religion back to this poor population. Because what they find is a lot of Soviets still maintain their Christian faith. They kind of went underground. So there are cases of like Soviets who they took the church bell during Soviet times and like hid it in their house, and then they bring it back when the Germans come in. And so they discover, these civilians aren't godless. They're good Christians like us. And there's this really interesting relationship there. And there's some soldiers like Hans Albring who attend Orthodox worship services and kind of make friends with local priests. And here's a question for you. What do you think Adolf Hitler is going to say about this sort of thing?
Well, this is the thing, because all the time I'm thinking is that big debate that you get on the internet about whether or not Hitler was a Christian or an atheist, and there's things he said confirming both points of view depending on what point of his life you're going into. But it's this paradoxical question again, is that we know in principle Hitler doesn't really want the church to be part of the Third Reich and what the Nazis stand for. But in this particular case, is it just a case of kind of the lesser of two evils? He wants the destruction of the Soviet people and the domination of them is more important than the rejection of the religion that he is actually against, but less against than his land expansion, I suppose.
Yeah, it is complicated. But
priorities, I suppose,
what
isn't
Hitler
it? Yeah.
does is he immediately issues an order stopping this practice of opening churches. Well, he doesn't say that churches can't be reopened, but he says that soldiers cannot worship side by side with these subhuman Slavs, so to speak. Hitler's his religious views are quite interesting. I would put him in almost the category of like he sort of invents his own religion. Like he talks a lot about providence and being inspired by some kind of divine force. But everything he believes goes against pretty much every Christian principle.
Yeah. To me, he plays the room to some extent.
He plays the role
when he says exactly the right things to kind of not piss off the church and the Lutheran church and Catholic church in Germany, and to other people when he's talking to perhaps workers or unions or whatever, he has a different way of looking. So he's very much selective in what he says, depending on who he's saying it to and in what circumstances. He's kind of it is complicated. And I say any argument I've ever been in on the internet about whether or not Hitler was religious has always ended up in just people just being very abusive to each other, because there is no definitive conclusion we can say, because there was as many quotes saying he is, as many. It's we could do that on World War II TV, or just talk about Hitler's faith. Or
it's a rabbit hole.
It is a massive rabbit. It's the biggest rabbit hole possibly we've ever tackled on World War II TV. We're not going to do it today, but it's fascinating right now. The paradoxical nature of opening up churches in a country you are brutally destroying. There's so many contradictions with this whole subject, frankly.
Yep, exactly. Yeah, and that's really what my research is all about. Is this kind of desperate attempt to assert moral superiority or to kind of believe in the morality of your cause when your cause is this mass destruction.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
So this photo here is obviously contemporary. So what's going on that one?
So this one is it's actually from Poland and from Soviet occupied Poland, which has now been taken over by the Wehrmacht. And these are worshipers who are going back to a church for the first time. You can see some bullet holes in there. But I believe there's a priest in the front, and it looks like a painting in front of him. And it's a propaganda piece. And actually, I think this one was in Signal, the German, Wehrmacht's international publication. Wow. And actually, I've been told there's an issue of Signal where on the front there's a German priest who's a member of the Wehrmacht who is baptizing Soviet children.
Wow. What's going on with that image?
What's going on with that? And so to kind of finish up the religion part there for a second, what ends up happening in the Wehrmacht is this strange contradiction where the Nazis are undermining religious practice. They restrict religious literature in the Wehrmacht. They stop replacing chaplains, so the chaplains are kind of dying out. And the Wehrmacht and German society in general is kind of getting more secular or heading down this Nazi path. But at the same time, the soldiers are still trying to keep up this idea that we're the good Christians, and the Soviets are the atheists. So that'll continue to be part of their justification and also part of the Wehrmacht myth. That the Germans kind of fought for the side of Christianity or were good Christians. Yep,
it's very complicated.
It is.
This is a slightly less complicated subject, but the preemptive strike myth, I think, is a really, really fascinating idea. So what's your views on that? We better do it before they do. Basically, is that what we're saying here, isn't it?
Yeah, essentially. So I think I put a number on this in the book. I think it's like 50% of the guys that I studied believed this idea, which is also propagated by the Foreign Office and Goebbels and the Nazi leadership, that this is essentially a just war because the Soviets were planning to invade Germany, or maybe all of Europe. And you write, or you see in their letters all the time, talking about, good thing we invaded them right now because, we just saved Europe from catastrophe, right? And what's interesting to me is you get kind of two versions of this. There's the ideological version, which is like, we're saving Germany from the Asiatic hordes, is like an actual quote from one of the soldiers I study. And on the other side, you have the guys who, for them, it's more of that old just war concept. Like, this is a good cause because we're saving people from the Soviets.
And again, the more negative elements you can attribute to the enemy. So they're subhuman, they're atheistic, they're Jewish, they're all those other, and the more positive things you can put on your side. We're doing this because of our tradition, our ideology, our Nazi fervor, our Catholic Lutheran faith, this is the way military. And it's the more you set those scales, it tips more and more, isn't it? Yeah,
it's like in my dissertation, this is a sentence I deleted because my advisor didn't like the phrasing, but I called it's like a moral buffet. So soldiers can kind of pick and choose, like, well, do I want to take the crusade option, or do I want to go with the ideological destroying the Jewish Bolsheviks justification? And the army is very good at throwing out these different sorts of possibilities
to the right audience. And then we come back to the idea we said about it being the pure Nazi SS is quite a narrow band, but this is, you can use it. You use religion on the religious members of your German company. You use racism element against other, and you create this package. You create this package.
Yeah, exactly. And if you go to the next slide, we'll see another one of these ideas. One of my favorites, liberation. So we're not fighting a war of extermination to destroy this country. We're fighting to bring peace and justice to this poor people who have been suffering under communism. And this is an idea that you see quite a bit in soldiers' letters. In fact, I think I have a quote about this. Let's see here. Here we go. Yeah, this is Hans Albring again. He says, far from all political and military considerations, I want to hope that many people would really like to experience freedom from the Bolshevist yoke. I'm especially thinking of the Ukraine. There's another guy who even wrote a poem about freeing the Ukraine, which is kind of interesting. And in this case, so there is this little kind of kernel of truth to this story, in the sense that when Germans roll into the country, there were actually a lot of civilians who greeted them pretty warmly. So you see in this photograph, I believe these are Ukrainians. Some are giving the Hitler salute, and throwing flowers at the Germans, putting up arches saying "We welcome the Wehrmacht." And to understand that, you have to understand a little bit about Soviet history and just what a lot of these people had gone through under the Soviet regime. I mean, the famines in the Ukraine, millions of people dying, political persecution, religious persecution. And so a lot of people, especially in the countryside, are not fans of Joseph Stalin.
Yeah.
And they also don't really know what the Germans are going to bring. It's, all they know is maybe things could get better under this new.
Yeah, and that's a very good point there, because the Soviet regime has not been great. And until you know how bad the Germans can be, it could feasibly have been seen as a better option. And also, you said at the beginning about the fact that a lot of Americans, perhaps, that there's not as much knowledge about the Eastern Front, the same applies to British, is that we are talking about a unit. We're talking about Estonia and Lithuania and Belarus and Ukraine, and all those countries had different histories, different pasts, different ideologies of their own, different governmental systems before the Soviet Union, different aspirations, different languages. So we can't group them all into all thinking the same thing. It is a plethora of reactions, but most of them I would think would be fairly negative after a while. I mean, that's the thing. It might seem to be a better thing that's come your way, but yeah.
Yeah, and that gets very complicated. There are other historians who have written about this kind of initial welcome. It generally speaking, the more time they spent with the Wehrmacht, the less inclined they were to be supportive of the Germans. Although it is kind of interesting, I found some German intelligence reports as late as 1944, when the Germans are retreating, still saying that some of the population prefer the Wehrmacht and the Germans, even though they've been suffering under 4 years of terroristic rule. So it's kind of like pick your poison.
So what kind of things were these soldiers writing back about the liberation? Again, how were they justifying it as liberation? I mean, we're clearly not going to be seeing the scenes like we saw in cities like Paris or Rome or Brussels, where people are coming out tearful and flowers and coming to my. It's not going to be like that. So how are they managing to convey in their letters, which is your primary use, back to their families, that this is a liberation and not conquest? What tools are they using?
Very, very good question. The tools include candy, chocolate, bread. So a lot of soldiers, and this is where you see both the words in their letters talking about liberation and the people are happy to see us, but then they also write about these little gestures. And that's particularly fascinating to me. So this picture on the left here from a propaganda newspaper is of German soldiers handing bread to Soviet workers. The picture on the right is about German soldiers helping to put out fires that the Soviets started when they retreated. And so the relationship with the population gets exceedingly complicated in the letters. There are enormous racist attitudes toward Eastern Europeans, toward Slavs, soldiers writing about how dirty and lazy and just kind of subhuman these people are. But at the same time, they also like to tell their families these nice little things they're doing, giving people cigarettes, paying for items that they take, so then it's not really theft, we're paying for them. And you got soldiers who are like cutting firewood for people, kind of befriending the civilian population, lots of photographs of like smiling German soldiers next to civilians. And soldiers spend a lot of time, especially in the winter, quartering in Soviet houses. But what's so fascinating is a lot of the same guys who try to build up this image of like a benign occupation where we're kind of making things better for people. The same guys talk about mass theft, executions, throwing people out into the cold, taking over their houses. So one day they might burn down the village, and then the next day they offer someone a cigarette. And I guess my theory is sort of in their minds that it's preserving their sense of decency, that they can say, well, giving out the cigarette is more of a reflection of who I really am than, taking part in some scorched earth action. So,
and again, you mentioned scorched earth there. I'm assuming there's the same paradoxical nature from the Wehrmacht commanders in that on the one hand, they're still issuing orders to burn that village down because there's suspected, resistance in that one, burn that one down because we don't want to do. And at the same time, but make sure you get a nice photo of yourself giving some chocolate to the kids. So there's a contradiction of orders coming through. Is that the case?
Yes, absolutely. So certainly in propaganda, you have a lot of articles praising sort of the helpfulness of the German soldier and how we're bringing order and peace to the East. But on the more institutional level, if you look at German commanders, what I found is, they are spending most of their time in this kind of terroristic occupation regime, again, where if someone looks at you wrong, you destroy the village, curfews, death zones, where if any civilian walks into a certain area, they're immediately killed. But a lot of the same commanders that are issuing those orders are also instituting some more what I call like conciliatory policies or mild policies, such as kind of giving horses to the civilian population or tools so they can bring in the harvest, kind of putting the economy back into order, offering medical care to civilians. And soldiers write about this a lot, that the medics on their units will help the civilians. You've got units that are, one of my favorites is holding festivals for the population. Like they make holidays a big thing and invite the civilians and have games and prizes and all this stuff. I argue it's part of an attempt. So on the one hand, you're trying to win civilians over to the Wehrmacht, right? So especially with all the horrific treatment that was going on, if you could win civilians to your side by maybe giving them more food supplies, or in some cases, there are even units that take from their own fuel supplies so civilians can operate tractors. It's kind of seen as helping the war effort by building back the economy, especially winning civilians to your side. You're going to have a better chance of kind of preventing people from turning into the partisan movement. And potentially also sort of helping out the Wehrmacht's economic prospects, right? If you can get, the tractors going again, repair some of the destruction, then you're helping yourself out. So I don't necessarily see it as humanitarian. I do think there's some commanders who still believed in that old military honor code, who genuinely were trying to kind of make life better for civilians in some ways. But for the most part, I see all of these practices as more along the lines of that military necessity, pragmatism. But at the same time, they help the soldiers to overcome their moral scruples. So you have soldiers writing home about how, in my unit, we give out candy to civilians, or we have this policy against theft that our commander is enforcing. And again, giving the homeland this kind of distorted impression of what the occupation was actually about.
And clearly what I'm learning from you now is that the creation of this virtuous Wehrmacht is not just a denial of the shit stuff, but it's a positive creation of the good stuff, of a fake good stuff. It's both. It's both. It's not just denial. It's positivity. And I'll throw a question at you, which is a potential kind of hand grenade there from Brad on this day in Canadian military history. This might be brought up later, but did the letters reveal anything about sexual assault against the civilians? Another potentially huge topic, but I'll let you handle it.
Yeah, that's a very good question. In the letters that I read, I did not see any accounts of sexual assault, but I don't believe that's because it didn't happen. In fact, there's a study in German by Professor Regina Mühlhäuser, who has written about rape on the Eastern Front. And I forget her numbers, but she concludes that it is ubiquitous. That soldiers are taking advantage of civilians. I think it's one of those topics that's kind of a taboo, that, most soldiers just didn't, even if they witnessed something or took part in something, they didn't feel comfortable putting that in writing to the homeland.
Or they convinced themselves it was something that it wasn't. They convinced themselves it was a love story that they'd witnessed, as opposed to a brutal rape, I suppose. Another question we just had, a very simple one. This is Pat is asking you, do you read and speak German, or did you use translation for this?
Yep. I read and speak German. Yep.
It seems obvious that to go to this level, you'd have to have a better than just kind of Google Translate version of this, because you've got to understand the nuance and the kind of the meaning behind the words as well, isn't it? And see that, and that's why, although you said you didn't use the references to "Mum, can you send me cigarettes?" it will help you get the tone of a letter, the feeling, the mood that guy is in when he's writing that letter. That would all come from that. Just the way a letter is started and ended will tell you a lot, isn't it? How long the letter is, I suppose. How neat the handwriting is. I suppose all of those are subliminally giving you some idea about what the guy's mental state is when he's writing it, I suppose.
Yeah, it definitely. I know German. Took many years. It's not an easy language, I would say. I guess one of the good things is soldiers' letters tend to be relatively simple in the kinds of language they use. So you don't need to be an absolute master of German, because these are 20-year-old guys writing to their mom. It's not, they're not writing a dissertation. Although you do get some really annoying ones who are more educated, who, I definitely needed a dictionary in some cases to know what they were talking about.
Well, it's not a good archive. You'd have to go to a dictionary at least once or twice. You've got to learn some new stuff. But rattling through, I'm aware of the fact that we're battling the clock. But death and victimhood, when you sent me the PowerPoints, sounded a really intriguing little topic for discussion.
Yeah, so this is the last major topic, and then I'll get into my conclusions. But I have a chapter on death and burial in the Wehrmacht, and also this idea of victimhood. And I actually want to start with another quotation. This is from OKW, so the Supreme Command of the Wehrmacht, which issues this regulation right before the war. And they say, as a matter of principle, the graves of fallen enemies, regardless of nationality, will be treated and honored in the same manner as the German ones. So as the High Command is drawing up the criminal orders and saying we're not going to treat these people as humans, they're also issuing orders that we're going to bury them with full military honors. Another crazy,
paradoxical, ironic, weird whole state of affairs there. Burying the very people that you're murdering.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so to kind of simplify this chapter a little bit, what I write about is how the Germans used burial practices to assert moral superiority over the Soviets by showing that we bury each of our men, and supposedly we're going to bury the Soviets too. They don't really do that. They just kind of say they will. We give them military honors. We have these funerals and Heldengedenktag, which is this like memorial day to the fallen heroes, building up beautiful cemeteries behind the lines. And it's all kind of in the service of showing what a civilized institution the Wehrmacht is. It respects life and death. And then they contrast themselves with the Soviets. The Soviets, at least to my knowledge, didn't really have much of a burial service. At least during the early years, they tended to have mass graves, or they didn't really have the capacity to bury their men. And so there's this kind of moral attack on the Soviets as, not caring about the lives of their men, whereas the Germans, we're civilized.
We're doing it the proper way. We're the ones with a moral compass. We're doing it. We're honorable. Yep. We're doing this the same way that we would do it in any war. This is a noble way of doing it, and justification. The justification is the word that keeps coming back into this as well.
Yes, it does.
It's
and this so death. As the war goes on, more and more soldiers are dying. The burial system starts to break down, and what I start to see in letters, and this is part of that change over time question, is a sense of victimhood that creeps in. Soldiers talking about all the physical and mental hardships they're going through. There's a picture of, trying to move a single vehicle through the mud, absolutely exhausted, fighting for months at a time without any kind of rest, lack of food. One guy wrote about his people's teeth falling out because of malnutrition. The kind of suffering they went through is hard for us to imagine. And it starts, they try to remain optimistic, but it bleeds into their letters more and more as the war goes on. And so I write about how this sense of victimhood starts to become part of the soldier's identity. And if you're a victim, it's harder to be a perpetrator.
Yeah.
So soldiers will write about, yes, we're pretty terrible toward the civilians, but it's even worse for us. We're the victims here. We're starving. So it kind of takes the spotlight away from their victims and makes them the victims. So it's this kind of interesting reversal.
And the victimhood issue is still alive and well. I mean, I mentioned the Stalingrad film, which, well, for my money, is one of my favorite films from World War II. But the Germans are very much portrayed as the victims in that, and you watch it and you have sympathy for the characters and what they're dealing with, and the cold and all the and the suicides and things like that. And there's no. I can't remember if there's any atrocities. There's obviously brutal combat portrayed, but this is something that still endures, and again reinforced. We touched on this at the beginning by the fact that in 1945, when the Soviet armies, the Red Army, pushed their way into Germany, they go on to do some horrific things themselves, and journalists and people who are there who've been through the war. All of us tend to remember more strongly the most recent experiences you've been through. So people who'd seen German on Soviet atrocities in 42 or 43, but then saw Soviet on German atrocities later in the war, perhaps the ones that are stronger in your head as the war comes to an end are those Soviet on German ones, which kind of helps propel this myth of the Germans being, or the Wehrmacht, I should specifically say, being so, innocent of everything and yes, victims. It is really, really fascinating stuff.
Yeah. Absolutely. So now we can get to the conclusions.
Yeah.
A couple of points that I think are the most important. So the first one is going back to the idea that the Wehrmacht was not 100% Nazi. That you had other value systems, whether that's Judeo-Christian, the kind of honor code, or what have you. And this makes the Wehrmacht scarier and more powerful. So this is an army that it doesn't just burn down the village. It can also hand out candy first. It's an army that's able to appeal to a very wide and broad variety of men in its ranks to get them on board with this project by any means necessary. So again, you got the crusade stuff for one group. You got if you want liberation, you can go with liberation. And the way the Wehrmacht operates, it's not just following Nazi ideology to the letter. It's doing some things that deviate from that ideology, like that handing out food to civilians. But by doing so, it helps the individual soldier to believe that he's fighting for a righteous cause.
And it also means the Wehrbrüs can, to some extent, legitimately say the Wehrmacht were not like the Nazis. That is not a false statement, because what you're saying is part of the rationale for their crimes were not Nazi-based. So they were still shit, but it wasn't all exclusively Nazi. So there are certain statements you can say that the way you use language, you can somehow still say something. Yeah, like I say, you can say the Wehrmacht were not like the Nazis. I don't know if anyone's ever said that sentence, but you could use that in two different ways, couldn't you?
Yeah, and I definitely don't want to give the impression that I'm saying, the Wehrmacht was somehow not influenced by ideology. It absolutely was. I'm kind of saying that it's worse.
Yeah, I think that's the point we're making. It's worse.
I guess to me, like if you, I don't know, there are some scholars who say, well, the reason German soldiers did what they did and thought what they thought is because they were so indoctrinated, and that explains. I'm kind of saying they they knew better, first of all. So one thing you notice in the letters is they do recognize, and kind of express sympathy for their victims, and talk about how they, they aren't really completely okay with a lot of stuff they're doing, but they still manage to justify what they're doing, even without ideology. So it's, I don't know. I guess,
and also more, sorry to interrupt again, more uncomfortable for us because we can separate the Nazis from ourselves. We can say, well, I'm not a Nazi.
Yeah.
But when we start bringing in Christianity, a lot of people watching this would identify themselves as Christians. I'm not folks. I'm not blaming this on the. I'm not saying that the Wehrmacht was evil because they were a Christian. I'm saying that there's an element of their ideology because of their faith and their national pride that is tied up with this. But it does make it more uncomfortable for us to kind of, because we connect with them a little bit more, don't we? And we see faults in ourselves. Whereas if we just blame it on the Nazi regime that Hitler brought in, and we can kind of put it in a box. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And that takes me to my second point, which is, it's sort of like, as the individual soldier, you could either justify yourself through ideology if that made sense to you, if that worked for you. But you could also take a different path to get to the same place.
Yeah.
Right. So you could consider yourself a good, upstanding family man. You could, talk about how you haven't really committed crimes. You offer different justifications for them, or you're liberating the Soviet Union, whatever you want to believe. But whether you try to take the ideological route or the traditional morality route or some combination, you're getting to the same place. And the same place is being a willing participant, an enthusiastic participant in this more or less genocidal operation.
Yeah, the results are the same. The cause and how they got there is very different. And I know you're going to expand on the last point about the letters there. And just quickly before I forget, Matt Johnson asked you about how it was that these letters ended up being in the archive. They were written to the family. Was there some kind of national plea at some point to people to send in their letters? How did they end up there?
Yeah, that's a good question. My sense is they're donated by family, or either that or the archive kind of goes out and asks people. So a lot of them are like basically grandpa's letters that have been sitting in the basement or the attic, and people find them, and maybe grandpa dies and they donate them to the archive.
So they may have been donated with a field jacket or a bayonet or something. It was just part of a package as opposed to necessarily kind of making some kind of plea for, we need to understand this from the point of view of the letters home. It was just something they ended up with. Is that what you're saying?
So it's kind of, in a lot of cases, I don't really know the motivation for donation. But one thing so I've read some letters from those families that came along with the donation that actually say, we want the world to know what our dad or our grandfather really did on the Eastern Front. And that's why we donated the letters. I guess initially I was worried that I get a very whitewashed view of things because they are donated. So, people would only donate letters if they were sure grandpa didn't do anything bad in the war. Given the fact that the vast majority of them talked about their own atrocities, I'd say, I can be, fairly confident that there was not a whitewashing operation going on with the donations.
Yeah, no, good stuff. So, I mean, I feel, and some of the people on the sidebar are thinking it's as brilliant as it's been, this presentation. It's raising more questions in some ways than providing others. But that's what good historical conversation does, isn't it? Is that if we could wrap everything up in neat boxes and say, well, we've sorted that one out, we'd have there'd be nothing to talk about. We'd not still be discussing who Jack the Ripper was and how was JFK killed. If we had these definitive answers, there'd be no point having historians. So it's really interesting talking to you. So, before we kind of wind things up, what kind of people do you hope will read your book? Obviously, you know the kind of the people who are genuinely interested in a broader knowledge will find it anyway. But I'm guessing you do want to get through to some people who are rather stubborn in their opinions about the Wehrmacht. Is that something that was active in the way you're kind of going at it?
That's a good question. I guess I wrote it with a few different audiences in mind. There's the academic historian audience on the one hand, but I'm really hoping that it's accessible to anybody with an interest in World War II. But now that you're talking about it, it's probably the people that still have a bit of a romanticized view of the Wehrmacht are probably the most important readership, because I hope I can change a few minds about what the Wehrmacht was really doing on the Eastern Front, of people who have differing opinions at the moment. So yeah, that's a very good question.
Well, I mean, so your website details are in the description of the video below, and also they're on screen there now, and people can contact you. So obviously you welcome discussion and
yeah,
happy to do more podcasts and happy to talk to the people, because it's an important subject. And I think although it kind of good examination makes you question yourself as well as your knowledge. I'm considering my upbringing. Where does my moral compass come from? And I outside of my World War II interests, I do get involved in debates about religion and things like that. I find it intensely fascinating, and philosophy and why do people do things. And this, I think your book, I haven't actually received it yet. It should be arriving typically tomorrow, the day after the show. But if it arrives tomorrow, I can't wait to dive in and kind of read these letters fully. So brilliant stuff. So what next? He said it was 7 or 8 years of work on this. What's next? A deeper dive into this, or
that's
something else completely different?
That's a very good question. I'm not completely sure. I've kind of moved more into the corporate teaching world from the academic world. I do have a couple of not articles, but book chapters that should be coming out next year. One about kind of morality and the individual in the Third Reich, and then one about the Wehrmacht using morality as a weapon in its strategy on the Eastern Front, essentially. So a couple of things that are coming out soon. As far as next projects, I'll have to think about that. I've been thinking about writing about morality in the Third Reich in a more general sense, kind of with the Wehrmacht as one example, because I do think, one takeaway from the book is, not everyone bought into Nazi ideology, but you didn't have to.
You didn't have to still be a shitty person.
And that's the scary thing.
A tagline for the show. You don't have to be a Nazi to be a shitty person. For the paperback edition, you can have that one on me. I won't charge you for that. But what's gratifying to me, and I don't want to kind of talk about myself, is that we've been sitting talking about this for nearly 2 hours, and it proves there is an audience of people who actually want to go into a little bit more deep and understand the morality issues and what the people. And it isn't all just about, is the Messerschmitt 109 better than the Hurricane or the Spitfire, and why did the Tiger so and so fail? There is a more a depth of discussion about the human condition, I suppose, that can be tied up with World War II. And the fact that there are people watching this all the way through and commenting is really, really, really pleasing, that people are committed to this kind of subject. So hopefully that will spur you on to do a bit more of this kind of work, because it's important, the work you do. And a shout out to Dr. Philip Blood, who's watching, because people like yourselves I don't get my mind is never changed more about kits now. I don't get a book about an aircraft and it changed my world. It doesn't. I go, yeah, okay, no book on this. Yeah. It's the understanding the whys. That's where my brain goes. The moments recently on World War II TV is Mark Johnston, the Australian historian, telling me about the 9th Infantry Division guys who'd fought at the siege of Tobruk were getting white feathers from Australian civilians because they weren't defending Australia's homeland. And it's like, that was apparently it's quite common knowledge among the academic community of World War II and Australia. But to me, that was like what these guys are sitting in 18 inches of dust in the desert, and they're getting a white feather because they're not defending their country. They're the ones. Those things make me think. And your comments today about where these Wehrmacht people are getting their morality from is kind of mind blowing stuff. So I thank you again for for joining us. I'm just going to remind you what we've got coming up tomorrow, and I'll say goodbye to you in a second. So, folks, a bit more light-hearted, as I said earlier, tomorrow. Kate Jameson is joining us. Remember, we had her show scheduled, and then she had to go off and do some exciting things with maritime security, but she is with us tomorrow to talk about some of those wonderful examples of tradition and customs that the Royal Navy and the Commonwealth Navies, Royal Australian Navy, were still doing in World War II, some of which dated back to Nelson's era and beyond. So we'll learn about some of the language terms. We'll learn about the ensigns and saluting and rum rations. So that'll be kind of an interesting way to slide into the weekend. And then next week, it's Aviation, the Pacific Week. Fantastic shows coming up. We're talking bombing of Japan. We're talking Doolittle Raiders. We are doing a show about the Douglas, the Dauntless dive bombers. We are doing an aviation show about an aircraft. But right now, as usual, don't forget to share what we're doing on social media. Please consider becoming a patron. Go out and buy David's book right now. Don't think about it. Just go there and buy it and order it, or put it on your Christmas wish list. It's not very Christmassy subject, but whatever. It doesn't matter. But anyway, right now, thank you very much, David Harrisville, for joining us. Did you enjoy it?
Thank you so much for having me.
Perverse way of talking about atrocities on YouTube, but did you enjoy it?
I did. Yeah. It's really great to get my research out there. So
brilliant. You. Well, that's it then. So this is Paul Woodadge for World War II TV saying I will see you all again tomorrow, same time, 7 p.m. UK, to talk about Royal Navy Customs. Thank you, everybody, for your time this evening. It would be pointless if we were just talking to ourselves. Thank you very much for your commitment to this channel. It's most appreciated. Bye, everybody.